Good evening. I'm Joe McFarland. I'm the Dean of St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, and I want to welcome you to the 8th Annual Lecture in honor of Lieutenant Commander Eric S. Christensen. Lieutenant Commander Christensen was a man of unusual talent, cultivation, and valor. He graduated with honors from the United States Naval Academy in 1999, and he taught English classes at the Academy while also attending the Graduate Institute at St. John's College across the street. He was a lover of arts and of literature. In 2005, while serving as a task unit commander of a SEAL team in Afghanistan, he led a mission to rescue a SEAL reconnaissance squad that was engaged in a firefight with overwhelming Taliban forces. He and 10 other SEALs died in that effort. For his service, he was awarded many honors, including the Bronze Star with a V for Valor and the Purple Heart. And he's survived by his father, Admiral Edward K. Christensen, and his mother, Suzanne Christensen, who are regular attendees of the lecture series. The friends and family of Commander Christensen established this memorial lecture series to create closer ties between his two alma maters in Annapolis and to stimulate thought about civilian-military relations and about the place of liberal arts in a civic and military education. And both institutions of higher learning hold that a life dedicated to service of our country should also be dedicated to reflection on our nation's fundamental principles. This lecture series is sustained annually by generous gifts given in memory of Lieutenant Commander Christensen and by the Navy SEAL Foundation. I invite you at the close of the lecture to attend the question period. The question period will be held on a separate Zoom link, so the lecturer and the audience may see one another when asking questions. And if you misplace the link for the question period, it can be found on the St. John's webpage for the formal lecture series or for the Christensen lecture series. Now to our lecturer tonight. Dr. David Gioe is an assistant professor of history at the United States Military Academy at West Point. He is also a history fellow for the Army Cyber Institute, and currently he's a visiting senior research fellow in the Department of War Studies at King's College, London. In his global professorship at King's College, he's examining why and how state intelligence services have harnessed emerging technologies to shape the information environment for strategic ends. Dr. Gioe was himself also an intelligence officer, serving as a counterterrorism analyst and serving multiple overseas tours as an operations officer. His articles on these subjects have appeared in the Washington Post, the Washington Times, the National Interest, and in Foreign Policy, as well as other media outlets. His lecture tonight is entitled America and Russia in the Information Environment, How to Survive in Today's Social Media Battlefield. Dr. Gioe, please, I welcome you to St. John's and to the United States Naval Academy. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dean McFarland, for the kind invitation. It's an absolute honor to be here. I would say with you tonight, but COVID-19 has virtually enabled this. I wanted to first and foremost acknowledge the Christensen family, in particular Eric's parents, Admiral and Mrs. Christensen. And I also wanted to thank my shipmate, Lieutenant Commander Mike Zampella, Dean Joe McFarland, who you just saw, and also Heather Latham for their assistance in setting this up this evening. We are here to honor the life and the legacy of Lieutenant Commander Eric Christensen, both a scholar and a warrior with connections, obviously, to the Naval Academy and also to St. John's College. Along the lines of in memoriam, however, I also wanted to mention my friend Major Chris Kennedy, U.S. Marine Corps, who graduated a year ahead of Eric at the Naval Academy. Branched Marine Aviation, was an Annapolis instructor like Eric, and died at his own hand in 2007, in the summer of 2007. We've lost far too many, both in combat and also through various causes that lead them to take their own lives. And in fact, the tie I'm wearing tonight was one that I bought while Chris and I were on temporary duty in Germany the year before he died. So our loved ones are always in our thoughts, and of course this is a lecture series dedicated to them and to Eric Christensen in particular. The disclaimers. This presentation is just me, thanks to the Army Cyber Institute, King's College London, and the British Academy for enabling my research, but it does not represent any position of the United States Military Academy, the Department of Defense, or the US government. Okay, on to substantive issues. I'm going to go for about an hour, and I've got a lot I want to cover with you, but I hope that it will engender robust Q&A. So first, I want to provide some context and the long view of intelligence and influence operations in statecraft. I'm a historian by background and training, and I think the long view is critical. Before we get to the Russians, because it's always sort of Russia, Russia, Russia now, I wanted to examine a non-Russian case study as well. I want to consider why Russia, amongst many others, turns to influence and disinformation operations. What's the strategy there? I want to examine through a couple of case studies how the Russian Internet Research Agency, the IRA, the name is subsequently changed, but I think everybody knows it as the IRA, so we can just sort of stick with it for clarity. They've created bespoke disinformation to target Americans and to target US service members and veterans in particular. So I want to look at some of their tactics. And then finally, I want to look to some other countries and some other points of view for resilience and remediation ideas to counter the plague of disinformation. I've got a pretty robust thesis here. I've got 6 points, and then I'll stop with the very wordy slides. The first one is that disinformation, both foreign and domestic, is a critical national security threat. It's not said as such in our discourse, and so this sort of seems obvious to me and maybe to others, but it's rarely stated, and I think it's time to actually start seeing it in national security documents. Disinformation, both foreign and domestic, intersect and overlap in ways that challenge typical American conceptions of national security. And who's responsible for national security? It challenges our legal authorities and the structure of our defense and our intelligence communities. Disinformation should be treated, as I've said, as a national security threat. And I think the time is right for the Biden administration's national security strategy team to really look at this and to give it pride of place in their, as they draft their own national security strategy, and to resource it appropriately. Point 4, social cohesion and critical thinking are now a critical pillar of US national security. The response of the government and of broader civil society, that is to say us, will have a decisive impact on the preservation of liberal democratic institutions, how we rise to this threat. And finally, we can learn from other countries, but ultimately it's up to us. Okay, some definitions. What is disinformation? Disinformation is essentially false information that is deliberately intended to deceive. We often differentiate this from misinformation, where someone is misinformed. And for the purposes of an intelligence scholar or a practitioner like myself, this can be lumped under the broader umbrella of Russian active measures. Other things would include covert action, forgeries, political warfare, assassination, etc. From Sun Tzu to Machiavelli to Clausewitz to Gerasimov, across places and times, information in conflict is critical. Hear the words of Sun Tzu from 5th century BC China. To win 100 victories in 100 battles is not the acme of skill. To subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. Hence, to fight and to conquer in all your battles is not supreme excellence. Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. Moving to 15th century Florence, Niccolo Machiavelli told his prince that men discontented and desirous of change are able to open the way for the invasion of their country and to render its conquest easy. Prussian General Karl von Clausewitz, one of the great military thinkers in 19th century Prussia, counseled that leaders should pursue operations that have direct political repercussions, that are designed in the first place to disrupt the opposing alliance, to paralyze it, to gain us new allies, or favorably affect the political scene. And then finally today, the chief of the Russian General Staff, General Valery Gerasimov. Information operations could be employed to defend and advance Russia's national interests beyond its borders. The role of non-military means of achieving political and strategic goals has grown, and in many cases, they have exceeded the power of force of weapons in their effectiveness. General Gerasimov is a real thinker, and I think he is onto something there. And so this is an oversimplified view, but I think it's important sometimes to look through the telescope the other way. The American view, as we might have it, puts conventional operations and conventional hardware, conventional tactics at the fore, and then information operations, psychological operations, cyber operations, that sort of stuff is in support. The Russian view seems to me to be maybe not a perfect opposite, but they emphasize information operations at the fore and conventional operations in support. It's a different way of approaching conflict, and it's worth bearing in mind. For you Game of Thrones fans, you'll see the same guy over and over again. And in this case, there's many names of information and conflict. And as you're reading, you may see information war, informationized conflict, political warfare, hybrid warfare, new or next generation warfare, and finally, gray zone conflict. These things aren't all the same, and I'm sure that folks can quibble about what they mean in particular. But one thing they all have in common is that using information, disinformation, misinformation is at the heart of any strategy in this area. I want to start with a little bit of history. As I said, I don't want to go right to the Russians, because the Russians didn't invent some fire. They didn't invent some new way of thinking about warfare. And so let's go back to Europe in 1941. It's the Germans again, and almost all of Europe is under the boot of Germany, or you'll note our Swedish friends and our Swiss friends are not participating. And Britain stands alone. The German submarine wolf packs, their U-boats, are posing an enormous threat to Allied shipping. Maybe you've seen the recent movie Greyhound with Tom Hanks. He's a destroyer commander escorting a convoy across the Atlantic. It's on Apple TV, and I would commend it to you as a little window, a dramatization into this. And the Germans were very successful. Allied and neutral merchant war losses were astounding in 1940 and 1941. Of course, America is in 1942, so that's a different picture. But in 1940 and 1941, Britain is losing goods. Remember, they're an island at an unsustainable rate. But where is America? America is neutral again. Here's one of those, Charles Lindbergh, the famous America Firster, the first generation of that, speaking to a crowd of folks who have no interest in getting into Europe's bloody wars. Well, Winston Churchill needs the Americans to get in. And he says, well, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. But I think Sir Winston would also say sometimes they need a little prodding. And in the First World War, the Great War, the Zimmerman telegram really came at the right time for the British. The Zimmerman telegram, just briefly, was a proposal of alliance from the Germans to the Mexicans in early 1917 as a way to keep the Americans busy fighting in North America and not come over to France and tip the favor in the favor of the Allies. And of course, that's what happened. The Mexicans did not throw their lot in with the Germans. But it's World War II now, and they're waiting for lightning to strike. The British are waiting for lightning to strike again. So enter Sir William Stevenson and British Security Coordination. Sir William Stevenson, as you can see on the bottom left there, he's affectionately known as Little Bill, and I'll show you Big Bill in a minute. But Little Bill was a Canadian, actually, wasn't British, but he was responsible for British intelligence liaison, and he was giving all kinds of intelligence to the Americans through his counterpart, Major General Wild Bill Donovan, or Big Bill, who was the head of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of CIA. And Stevenson well knew that almost everything he gave, if it was juicy enough, would go right to President Roosevelt. And so Bill Stevenson comes up with this map, and it's a Nazi map of South America. And it's showing, the German there is Luftverkehrsnetz der Vereinigten Staaten Südamerikas Hauptlinien, which translated means the air traffic nets for the United States of South America, and the principal lines. And basically what this is doing is it's showing that the Germans have a design not just on conquering Europe, but on conquering South America as well, sort of our hemisphere, according to the Monroe Doctrine. And so this is allegedly purloined from a German courier. It's marked Geheim in the upper left, or secret. And it's given from our British liaison contact there, Bill Stevenson, to Big Bill Donovan, and then ultimately to Roosevelt. Roosevelt immediately sees how explosive this is, just like the Zimmerman telegram was. And on his Navy Day speech in October of 1941, FDR uses it for political purposes. Here is what he says, quote, "Hitler has often protested that his plans for conquest do not extend across the Atlantic Ocean, but his submarines and raiders prove otherwise. So does the entire design of the New World Order. For example, I have in my possession a secret map made in Germany by Hitler's government of the New World Order. It is a map of South America and part of Central America, as Hitler proposes to organize it into 5 vassal states, bringing the whole continent under their domination, including our great lifeline, the Panama Canal. This map makes it clear the Nazi design is not only against South America, but against the United States itself, right? In other words, the Nazis aren't going to stop. The Nazis are threatening the Americans. It's not just a European war, and the Americans have to get into the fight, according to Roosevelt, to counter the America First and Charles Lindbergh crowd. Well, the Germans are understandably, upset about this, and maybe it's marked secret, so of course they would object. But the Germans vociferously deny the authenticity of the map. German propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, who's there on your right-hand side, rejected FDR's, quote, absurd accusations. In his estimation, this was a grand swindle intended to whip up American public opinion. Well, obviously, Joseph Goebbels was a monster, but in this case, he was right. This map was a forgery that was created by British Intelligence Arts and Crafts Department as a way to help the Americans find the evidence that they wanted to see to get into the war. Today, we might call that fake news. Now, judging the impact of these things is tremendously hard. And of course, what really brings the US into the Second World War is the attack on December 7th, 1941 at Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, not fake British maps. But nevertheless, I do think that there were plenty of examples, by the way, of this British map. There are other versions and other operations. But information plays an important role. After the war, Stevenson is decorated for his contributions to American intelligence, and the guy pinning the medal on him is Major General Bill Donovan of the OSS. Behind Stevenson are some OSS grandees. And I've always wondered whether Donovan had any doubts about the map that Stevenson gave him. But okay, so let's head back to the future. It's no longer the British manipulating the American information environment, but it does seem like it's everybody else. So let's have a look at the Russians in particular. There's a long history of Soviet and then Russian disinformation and influence operations. And this is active long before the internet age. You may have heard of Operation Infection that claimed that the United States government was responsible for the AIDS epidemic, that AIDS was created in a US government lab in Fort Detrick, Maryland. According to an Oregon State University study, 15% of Black Americans thought that the US government actually targeted them with AIDS. No, this is a Russian operation, but you can see the penetration of the target audience. There was a rumor that CIA was selling crack cocaine in Los Angeles, started by the Russians. False. The slogan, "Reagan means war." I should have put a exclamation point on it because that's how the Russians did it. And newspaper ads in the 1984 elections to try to help Walter Mondale against Ronald Reagan by painting Ronald Reagan in the Soviet view as a warmonger. And then finally, I mean, there's millions of examples. I just want to give you some highlights. In 1984, in the run-up to the Olympics in Los Angeles, the Soviets forged Ku Klux Klan white supremacist letters to athletes from African countries, threatening them with physical violence if they actually came to the United States Olympics. And it didn't work. Everybody but two Soviet allies did come to the Olympics. So in that case, that was a failure. But there's certainly a long history of the Russians and the Soviets swinging the bat. Okay, why do all this in the first place? I see, I think too many times that the Russians are just out there sort of throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks. But there is a strategy and it is discernible, and it can be distilled thusly. First, to assert great power status, to matter, to be considered, to be respected. Since international politics is a zero-sum game in most Russian view anyway, maybe not in your view or the American view, market share, if we can appropriate that term, must come at the US or at the expense of the West. The Russians use disinformation to preserve the Russian sphere of influence in the near abroad, in Belarus, in the stands, in Ukraine, in Georgia, and to keep America and NATO out of it. Some of it has nothing to do with Americans or the West at all. Some of it is to protect and burnish the image of the Putin regime. Some of it is to compensate for Russian conventional military shortcomings. The Russians know they can't stand toe-to-toe with the US or with NATO if you just look at order of battle. And so this is a good way to sort of have an asymmetric approach. And then finally, to compete with America and NATO in an area short of war. Right? The idea there is to keep things bubbling, but not boiling over. I don't want to say too much more about that, but I would commend to you an article in Lawfare on this topic by Casey Strickland. She is an analyst of things Russian at the Center for Naval Analysis, and you can Google her article here in Lawfare. Okay, let's look at some of the handiwork from the IRA and see if it compares favorably to Bill Stevenson and his map. That's their building, by the way, the so-called Trolls from Ogino. That's, as I understand it, I've never been there, but that's I didn't take that picture, but that's a four-story sort of nondescript building in an old part of St. Petersburg called Ogino. Okay, the IRA identified at least seven great cleavages in American society. I say seven at least because I think maybe you could point to more. But they got to work dividing us by targeting and weakening American social coherence, by increasing polarization, resentment, and mistrust. And there's tons of memes I could show you on the following topics: guns and Second Amendment issues, religion, conceptions of patriotism, immigration and cultural identity issues, what sometimes the Russians like to call values or European values, race and racism, and the elites or the establishment versus real people. Another way to paint that might be an urban-rural divide. And finally, veterans issues and the civ-mil divide, which I'd love to talk about all of these in great detail, but that would take a very long time. So given the connection between St. John's and Annapolis, I thought I would focus on veterans issues for the sort of prism that I guess that I'm going to be looking through for this talk. But basically anything that you don't want to talk about, with your family at Thanksgiving dinner is what the Russians want you talking about. Some of their attributes are: this is long term, participatory, emotional, tribal, and in my view, they're usually quite clever. Okay, the military and veterans are at the center of public life and American civil religion, to use Abraham Lincoln's term. And we see veteran issues, and sometimes, I think it gets, frankly, to be too much. But you've got your Jets camouflage helmet, your Mets baseball team. I don't know why I'm picking on New York teams, by the way. All teams do this. Everyone's in camouflage. Everything is a salute to veterans. And veterans, you can't go anywhere without getting a military discount. I don't think the founding fathers had a man with a flag and boxer briefs and 10% off at Jockey when they were standing up George Washington's army. But this is where we are today in America, and the Russians know that. And so this is a place where we do have a civ mil divide in this country, and the Russians have focused their efforts. Well, why should we focus on service members and veterans in the information environment? Well, veterans and service members enjoy a high degree of civic trust and social respect in America, although this may be declining, and we can talk about that, but it's still extremely high. According to Christopher Goldsmith, quote, veterans as a cohort are more likely than others to participate in democracy. That includes not only voting, but running for office and getting others to vote. The flip side to the above point is that veterans also participated in the Capitol insurrection on the 6th of January and did so in disproportionately high numbers. What does that mean then? I think it means that the military service doesn't create an immunity to false information. The Internet Research Agency bought at least 113 distinct online ads aimed at veterans and veterans advocacy groups during and after the 2016 election. And then, of course, these gain more traction when people repost them. The IRA page, quote, being patriotic, had over 200,000 fans or followers at one point. As I said, veterans were disproportionately represented in the Capitol riot. Nearly 1 in 5 defendants served in the military. And I think that President Putin noticed that and was quite pleased by it. The problem that we always sort of get into is we don't want to blame the Russians for everything because they're not responsible for everything. But foreign disinformation and domestic disinformation stew together, and they build off each other. They amplify each other. And I want to just read you 2 quick paragraphs from a report that was just published the other day by the Sufan Group, and it talks about the effect of foreign amplification. They say, quote, throughout 2020, the consistent foreign amplification of QAnon narratives online illustrates that externally driven disinformation efforts have contributed to the efficient spread of conspiracy theories. Indeed, the level of foreign influence during January and February 2021 continues this trend at an average of almost 20% of all posts analyzed by the Sufan Group. 1 in 5 has some sort of foreign nexus. Russia is often considered the most capable and sophisticated external driver of disinformation. Interestingly, however, our analysis shows that China is currently the state actor most involved in amplifying QAnon narratives on Facebook. In 2020, 44% of posts came from administrators in Russia, 42% from China, 13% from Iran, and 1% from Saudi Arabia. Essentially, the Russians are slightly declining, but the Chinese are really moving ahead, in case you're wondering why the percentages are different. The trend accounts for their observation there. Okay, I want to go back to 2015, and I want to go back to what I've identified as a Russian proof of concept. I'm not the only person to do this. Jade Helm was a military exercise. I don't know why we insist on naming military exercises these things, but we do. And it was called a controversial military exercise. This is a snippet, I think, from the Military Times or Army Times. And it wasn't controversial, except that Russian trolls called it controversial. And then people in America started calling it controversial. And then we stated it was controversial like it was a fact. Well, what was it? This is an unclassified map. It was a handout, and it shows that mostly special operations forces were having an exercise as you would expect them to do in Texas and across the American Southwest. Seems innocuous enough and certainly part of a routine. The military needs to train, obviously. Well, American political leaders and the alt-right started to amplify Russian disinformation to the point where actually the Texas State Guard was called up, which is it's not the National Guard in Texas, it's a different entity, but it was called up by the governor. And General Michael Hayden, who I deeply admire and I think is the sort of the smartest man in any room, he says Russian bots and the American alt-right media convinced many Texans that Jade Helm was an Obama plan to round up political dissidents. They're coming for your guns, they're coming for your politicians, and I think that's right. And so Hayden says, quote, at that point, I'm figuring the Russians are saying we can go big time. And at that point, I think they said, we're going to play in the electoral process. And that's exactly what they did in 2016. And then also with modifications moving forward in 2018, 2020. And I don't think that they are done by a long shot. So with that as preamble, let's check out some examples from the Russian information operations playbook. Step 1, pose as American veterans. Create what looks like organic content. In this particular case, this was a Facebook page that was Vietnam veterans. Of course, it wasn't Vietnam veterans, it was Russians in St. Petersburg calling themselves Vietnam veterans. And they made a meme that says, this is why we salute the flag. And it has a real picture of a Marine standing over his fallen comrade. And they say, this is why we stand for the anthem. And this, of course, is trying to drive a wedge in the, Colin Kaepernick, should I stand, should I not stand thing, about the national anthem, stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. And so, the Russians want to play in that area as well, because that's an American cleavage issue, and they want to get in there and see if they can widen it. Step 2. Create a following in the military or veteran community with agreeable images. Not everything is disinformation. Not everything is ridiculous. Like if you are proud to support our veterans, who wouldn't like this picture? A little boy. It's hard to tell. I think he might be African American. I'm not sure. Older gentleman who's clearly a veteran. Maybe he's on his way into a VA hospital. I'm not sure. But hey, that's sort of, bridging the generations. That's nice. The problem is that veterans come first as an IRA front, and they're just trying to get more people to like them, get more people to pay attention to them, get more people to get comfortable retweeting their stuff or sharing their stuff. Step 3, add misleading images. In this Instagram post by American.Veterans, which you will not be surprised if I tell you was the Russians, they've got 2 images. They have an image, and a quote. Now, the image is a real image, and the quote is a real quote. The problem is that the quote is not related to the image. And so you take a real image and a real quote, but you overlay them, and it becomes disinformation. In this particular case, this is an honor flight. And this is where American service members are returned to their families, usually on a small domestic flight, a commercial flight that you might be on yourself. In fact, I was on an honor flight once, and the pilot came on and said, please stay in your seats. We are an honor flight, and the family of the fallen is going to come greet the service member. So just hang on, and we'll deplane in a moment. It's a real image, and it's a moving image, and it, of course, it's designed to move you, but understandably so. And then it's got, the Russians have always loved to attack Hillary Clinton. They never forgave her because they thought that she was fomenting so-called color revolutions in the Russian sphere of influence in their backyard when she was Secretary of State. And so she did say the words, "What difference does it make?" Except that was in the Benghazi hearing, which had nothing to do with what you're seeing here. And so American.Veterans says Hillary Clinton will never understand what it feels like to lose the person you love for the sake of your country. Now there's over 17,000 impressions of this, and it cost the Russians $53. Step 4, stoke anger and resentment in the US military and the veteran community, and drive the civ mil wedge even deeper. Here's a more recent one that asks, this might be a struggling vet, maybe a homeless vet. It's certainly a problem. And it asks, feed 10,000 Syrian rebels? How about taking care of 50,000 veterans instead? Well, number one, that's a false choice. But number two, and more to our point about the strategy, as far as the Russians were concerned, the Syrian rebels were called terrorists because, of course, the Assad regime was a client state of the Putin regime. And so what they really want is to erode American support for US operations to support Syrian rebels. We can think that's a good policy or bad policy, of course. My job here with you tonight is to explain how the Russians are trying to achieve their strategy through images like this. Well, are we helpless? This is President Putin, number 11, playing in his hockey game. And who is helpless, I think, is the Russian defenseman and the Russian goalie, because if they stop him, they'll end up in a gulag somewhere. But we are not them, and we are not helpless. And there's a lot that we can do. And so I want to spend the balance of my time talking about resilience and how we might do better in the future. The first example comes from Estonia, where they have a blog, a webpage called Propastop. And it's just what you think it would be. It's aimed at cleansing Estonia from propaganda. And the Estonians don't do this as a governmental idea. They do this as a volunteer effort. And so you might consider it sort of an Estonian Snopes, if you're familiar with that, for disinformation. By the way, they don't talk about cybersecurity here, and I love that. They talk about information space security, right? It's much, much bigger than the ones and zeros. It's much bigger than the code. And so technological solutions are not sufficient here. And so they have a much broader view of this than I think most Americans do. And I applaud them for that. And I think we can learn from that. The Swedes put out, this is a picture of a little pamphlet that the Swedes used to put out during the Cold War. And it was called If Crisis or War Comes. And after the Cold War, they stopped doing it in the early 1990s because why? We've reached the end of history. Well, about 2 years ago, the Swedes have started putting this out again. And if you remember the yellow pages in the old days, it comes right to every Swede's home for their information. Well, what does it say? It's a little pamphlet. And so I've got a screenshot of it here. And if you look on the left-hand side under emergency preparedness, false information is the second thing down on page 6. I mean, the Swedes understand that false information should go above the event of a terror attack and many other things. It's that important. And I applaud the Swedes for doing that. Well, what do they say on page 6? They say, be on the lookout for false information. And I'm just going to linger on this because I think it's really worth reading. States and organizations are already using misleading information in order to try and influence our values and how we act. Their aim may be to reduce our resilience and willingness to defend ourselves. Right? Go back to Sun Tzu, go back to Machiavelli, go back to Clausewitz, and go back to Gerasimov. That's exactly what they're doing. But the best protection against false information and hostile propaganda is to critically appraise the source. And this is where the historian in me gets proud of the Swedes, because this is essentially what they're asking for is the historical method. Is this factual information or is it opinion? What is the aim of this information? Who has put it out? Is the source trustworthy? Is the information available somewhere else? Is this information new or old? And why is it out there at this precise moment? I mean, it might be worth making this page your background, or if you have a particularly tendentious relative, make it their screen background. Search for information. The best way to counteract propaganda and false information is to have done your homework. Absolutely. Look into it. Do not believe rumors. Use more than one reliable source in order to see whether the information is correct. And do not spread rumors. Don't participate. If the information does not appear trustworthy, don't pass it on. I think the Swedes have this exactly right. The Finns are also leaders, by the way, in media and information literacy. And this is something that we are not doing, at least that I can tell very much in our country. They say in Finland, media and information literacy is seen as a civic competence, important to every citizen from an early age. We can learn from the Finns. I think that's absolutely correct. It is a civic competence, and this challenges our understanding of national security, that other people are responsible for security, that the Pentagon is responsible, that the Navy, that the Army, that CIA, that FBI is responsible. No, in terms of information, we are all stakeholders. We all have a role to play. Well, it's no wonder then the Finns put so much emphasis on this, and they lead Europe in studying resilience to post-truth phenomenon, right? Like anything, like a diet plan or playing a musical instrument, right? If you stick to it and you practice and you get good at it, right? That's just what happens if you put in the work. And I think we've really got to put in the work in order for us to get better. I want to go back to skepticism and why it's usually important but insufficient. And I'm going to go back to my story, my vignette about the Brits. FDR's Assistant Secretary of State, a guy named Adolf Berle, urges skepticism. He says, this is in a memo he sends. He says, British intelligence has been very active in making things appear dangerous in Latin America. I think we have to be a little on our guard against false scares. Adolf Berle was absolutely right. Skepticism. Why do I see that? He was asking the questions that the Swedes are asking. Why am I seeing this right now? Who put it out? What do they want from me? Why is this in front of me? So, but even source checking sometimes isn't enough. Roosevelt responded to Berle and he said, look, let yourself rest easy. The source of this information is undoubtedly reliable. Now, normally it's true. The Brits are very reliable. But both of these men, Bill Stevenson on the right and FDR on the left, they needed the map to be true for their own political purposes. And so that's what became important. It wasn't important whether it was true. It became important whether the map was useful for what they wanted to do. This disinformation problem, it endures, without President Trump's Twitter feed or Russian malign influence, because I think as a society, I think we value information like the gentleman I just showed you. They value the information for its utility to advance a political view instead of whether or not it's true. This image, as far as I know, does not come from the Russians. It comes from somewhere in the United States. Someone put it on Facebook. And it was in the height of the Trump trade war with China. And of course, what they're trying to show you is that the president's daughter has shoes made in China, but they're exempt from Trump's tariffs because there's a rule for the Trumps and then there's a rule for everybody else. This has been shown to be, I think, PolitiFact rated it pants on fire false. Number one, there's sort of a dead giveaway that tariff is spelled wrong, but that tariff exempt was photoshopped on after the fact. Her footwear line was defunct before the president took office, so it's overtaken by events. It doesn't matter. And shoes were never part of the trade war anyway. But the point here, right, is to make you, the viewer, think that there are two rules, one for us normal people and one for the politically connected. All right, what are some key takeaways as we wind down here? I think we need to understand that there's a long history of foreign meddling in our information environment. But now digital advances mean that messages come directly to individuals, right? Before, the Russians could run an ad in a newspaper, send a forged letter. Now they come to us on our iPhones. In periods of national or international crisis, such as war or maybe a pandemic, right? A lot of the Chinese disinformation that we've seen revolves around blame for COVID and that sort of thing. And this increases the chances for disinformation to happen. In World War II, it was our friends, the British, who weaponized information for their own strategic ends. And then during the Cold War, it was the Soviets. And today it's the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, hacktivists, criminals, and unfortunately, it's also fellow Americans. Our information environment truly is under siege. what can we do? I showed you the Swedish thing. I would encourage you to go download that pamphlet. But I think what can we do particularly? We can set a good example in your team, in your office, in your family, on your social media network by doing your homework before reflexively posting or sharing content. To understand what the memes and other misleading content wants from you. The creators of memes want you to have a reaction. Ask yourself, how does this meme want me to feel? Don't rely solely on technology companies to cleanse your social media environment through algorithms and through wonderful content moderation. Number one, our muscles would atrophy if that happened. We need to have the skills to learn to identify this stuff. And number two, we can regulate social media companies, and maybe we should, but they are not the arbiters of truth. They're not the sole guardians of your, of what you believe to be true. And by the way, there's no algorithm that's going to stop this anyway. So I think we need to stop, barking at Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, and really take some responsibility for ourselves to do this. And then finally, I think we need to politely encourage others to practice media literacy, which we could put in the awareness column, and practice a culture of skepticism, which we would call the education column. If you'd like to read a little bit more about this, there's a history of fake news that I wrote for the National Interest magazine. It's online and it's not behind a paywall. You can Google that. And I try to answer the question, why can't America reliably separate out fact, falsehood, opinion, and reasoned analysis? It's from 2017. It's almost 4 years old, but I think it's stood up okay. And then also, I can commend to you something I wrote with a colleague of mine. Information isn't Russian. It's as American as apple pie, for an outlet called the Strategy Bridge. And we basically look at how Americans have used information warfare and narrative conflict, you might say, for most of our history as well, going right back to the Boston Massacre and other sort of early bits of American history. So let me stop there. Let me stop sharing my screen. So I very much look forward to your questions, and I thank you for taking the time this evening to spend with me, and I thank you for your attention. So out here, and I'll see you in a few minutes in the other chat room. Goodbye.